Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here today representing Allianz Global Investors at the 2023 Investment Forum. Allianz Global Investors has been working with BBLAM for more than 5 years now on our China strategies, so it probably comes as no surprise that today my topic is China. And it's a really good title, I think, to this presentation, China Outlook, Ready, Set, Grow, because as we know, there hasn't been a whole lot of good news out of China in the last few years. And so I think today it's really important that we get out there and share with you some of our newest thinking on China, because there's really a lot to be optimistic about. There's a lot of good news at this point in time, and we see a lot of good things happening in China. We think it's a really good time to re-engage on China. So in case you're not paying attention, you're focusing on your lunch, I'm going to repeat that. China is happening now, okay? So let's take a look at some of the slides that I've prepared and some of our thinking on what's changed in China and how to take advantage of the opportunities that we're seeing in the market. So first, I'll walk you through what's happened to China equities. Then we'll look at what has changed to support a turnaround in the market, and then we'll talk about how to position to best capture this recovery. So my presentation doesn't have too many charts, but I do want to show you this chart here on the right-hand side. And what it is showing you is in the blue is the onshore China market, so the A-share market. This is the market that is predominantly invested in by local domestic Chinese investors. The green line is the offshore China market. So these are the international shares. These are the shares that a lot of the internet and tech names that you might know, like Tencent, Alibaba, for example, are listed in the H-share market. The point of this slide is very simple. If you look at those two lines, it really doesn't matter what you did in China over the last 2 years. You would have lost money. It hasn't been a positive experience for most investors. And there's been 3 reasons why that's been the case. The first one, as you know, is China's zero-COVID policy. China has effectively been closed. Its borders have been closed. There have been very strict movement restrictions on the ground in China. The second is the housing market. We've had a credit crisis in the housing sector. We have seen large developers default on their loans, and this has created very negative sentiment in the property sector within China, in the housing market. And the property sector in China is 25% of its GDP. So it's a very important aspect of the overall economy. And then the third area is geopolitics. We know in the last decade, there have been a number of flare-ups in terms of trade relations and geopolitics between China and other nations, predominantly the US. And that is likely to continue into the future. So the good news that I want to share is that out of these 3 things, 2 of them are vastly improving. The first being the zero-COVID policy, which has effectively been reversed, and China has taken a U-turn in terms of its policy direction. The second is the property market. We've seen a stabilization in the property sector. We've seen macro policies designed to help shore up the financials and the leverage on the books of the property developers. And then the last part is geopolitics. And while I don't have a crystal ball to tell you things are going to get better, it does feel like things are relatively stable. There will be flare-ups from time to time, and that this competition between China and the US, particularly in the technology space, is likely to continue, but it feels pretty stable at this point in time. So let's take a quick look at valuations. I think this is important because the question I'm asked most frequently is now a good time to buy into China? And a good place to look is how cheap or expensive is the market? And so I want to show you here the A-share onshore market on the left and the H-share market on the right. And this is the price to earnings multiple. And you can see that from this that we're at around average levels. So over the last 15 years, the market has gone up and down. It's been quite volatile. We were arguably in a bubble territory back in 2007, but today's valuations look relatively cheap, below average, and so we think it looks like a decent entry point into the China market. So what has changed to support this turnaround? Let's take a little bit of a deeper look. Okay, so the three things that I mentioned, first of all, the swift exit from zero COVID. We no longer have mass testing every single day, PCR tests for people to enter a park or go into an office. We have more support for the property sector. There have been more than 16 measures announced to help extend financing to the property developers and to give them more leeway on their loans in terms of more time to repay that debt. So those are all very supportive for the property sector. And also, more recently, we've seen some new developments with regards to the internet sector. So there was a number of regulations introduced with regards to limiting the time that children and teenagers can spend online playing games. The ride-hailing app Didi was finally relaunched just in January, and I think just a couple weeks ago, the Ant Group has announced that they will have a capital raise. So we think a lot of that crackdown on the internet sector that was so punishing for the market has been lifted, and that's a real breath of fresh air for the China market. Here are a few pictures of just how quickly things have changed in China. The first one is a main road in Beijing. This is in December, in mid-December. There's not a car on the road. By late December, you can see shoppers are queuing at luxury stores buying branded goods in Hainan. And then by early January, this is the Shenzhen airport. It looks like business as usual. So things have changed very, very quickly as the economy has reopened. In terms of property, the property sector is a little bit unique in China. So the thing to note about how property sales work is that when a family wants to buy a home, they typically will pay for that home before it's actually built. So it's very different to what happened, for example, in the U.S. during the global financial crisis, when people took out loans for massive homes that they couldn't afford, that were well above their income thresholds. In China, the consumers can actually afford their homes, pay for their homes, and then never received that home. And so it's a very big problem. However, the new measures we think have really supported the system, and we know that those houses will get delivered. Those families that bought an apartment will get that apartment. It just may take some time to work through the system. It could be a few more years. So while we don't think the property sector is very, very exciting at this point in time because there are all these issues that need to be worked out, we do think that it has stabilized, and that's bringing more confidence into the market. And we've seen more construction being completed, and especially with the COVID restrictions reduced, more and more construction workers can go back on site and start building again. So how do we position for a recovery? We think 2023 is going to be a much better year in the China market. We think that earnings will recover. We think valuations will recover, but there will be pockets of the market that we think will do better, and that's where we want to be positioned. So let me walk you through this diagram of some of the areas where we are most excited as investors. And the first is the reopening beneficiaries. So these are companies that are directly or indirectly related to reopening. So think of things in travel and tourism, like airlines, airports, duty-free shopping. As the borders reopen, even within China, as people are able to travel domestically to go visit their families and friends in other cities, this is already having a meaningful impact, and we've seen this. Another area is consumer products. These are areas like food and beverage. So people are going out to eat now. They're going out for drinks after work. They're buying better food to entertain at home. And we think that trend is likely to continue. We also like cosmetics. If you think about it, if you haven't been out, you haven't had a need to leave your home, you probably haven't worn makeup or you haven't really looked at yourself in the mirror in a while. So, there's a good chance that you will upgrade your skincare, try to look a little better to go out. And we've seen, we've done a number of studies to prove that the preferences in China are shifting very much in favor of domestic brands. So consumers are no longer looking at Korean or Japanese or even European cosmetics labels. They prefer brands in China. And so we're playing into that as a theme. A second area, I've talked a lot about the property market, the stabilization of the property market, and while we still think the developers are under pressure, areas like construction materials, building materials, those types of areas like scaffolding, weatherproofing chemicals, these areas are very well positioned to grow as China has reopened for business and people go back to work. So there's a lot of interesting ideas coming out of that area. And also within the consumer area, certain ideas like furniture or home appliances. People are able to go out and test out a new sofa, buy a new mattress, get a new refrigerator. These are sort of big ticket items that typically people like to see in person before they buy, and now they can do that. So while all of the sort of macro-prudential measures towards the property market are very supportive for housing and construction, it's not so good for the banks because it's the banks that have to extend somewhat unfavorable terms to these developers in terms of their loans. And we think that the banks probably are not going to do as well in this particular environment. There are also sectors like telecommunications or materials that are subject to government regulation. We know in China that the policy can be introduced very swiftly and can have a meaningful impact. So we want to be careful that we don't go into sectors that become very heavily regulated. Another really important area for our investment team is in technology. And technology is a really broad area. So within technology, the areas we like include softwares, renewables or green tech, biotech, and the healthcare side. We are still more cautious on semiconductors. I'll show you more in a minute about our views on semiconductors because that does come up in the news all the time. It's a very pressing issue, but that area we think, just given the softness in the end demand for consumer electronics, the weakness we've seen out of markets like Korea and Taiwan that are also producing semiconductors, we're a little less optimistic on that area of the market. So overall, we think China is recovering strongly in 2023. We think this is going to be a much better year than what we've seen for the last 2 years, and we think China is getting back on track to grow very strongly. So China is no longer the imitator in technology, it is an innovator. There's a number of examples on this slide. China is the largest EV market. They have the longest autonomous vehicle road tests in the world. It's the number one in robotics, number one in patents, number one in solar. There are just so many amazing technological advances that are happening in China that are cutting edge. And we think this is a really exciting area for our portfolio. One of the key initiatives in China, and we're seeing this not just in China but around the world, is self-sufficiency. So in the interest of national security, China can no longer be reliant on other nations for things like cybersecurity, 5G, semiconductors, energy, food. All of this intellectual property needs to be housed within China and make sure that it's secure. And there are very many ways of playing this in the market. The R&D spending in China, you can see the yellow line here, has been growing at a very, very rapid pace. It's second only to the United States. The number of patents in China exceeds North America, the patent filings exceeds North America, Japan, Europe. So a lot of great innovation happening in China. We hear a lot about the semiconductor industry or chips and sort of bans on high-end chip sales from America into China. I think the thing to know about the semiconductor industry is that China's demand for semiconductors has quadrupled in the last 10 years. So this is a very important area for China. It's something that they need, yet their technology is several years behind the US and Europe, and it's not where it needs to be. So China really needs to ramp up in the semiconductor space, and they will, and they are, and they're working on this, as we speak. I'll give you an example. This picture here is an autonomous vehicle, a self-driving car. And you can see that there are a dozen applications of semiconductors just in this one product. There's the cameras, the sensors, the displays, the mirrors, the navigation. So that's just one example, and there are many, many other examples. China has a very robust semiconductor industry, but they still can't produce the very, very high-spec chips that are used in things like quantum computing or aerospace and defense, some of these areas where they really do want to develop that capability. And so that's an area that we're looking at very closely. Another thing that is exciting about China is green tech or renewables. So we know that China is a net importer of oil and gas. And as I mentioned earlier with regards to self-sufficiency, that puts China at risk from a national security perspective. They need to have their own energy supply. So the ambition in China is that by 2045, 90% of the energy supply should come from renewables. And so we've seen a huge ramp up in the renewable space in China. The map that I'm showing here is really to show you that much of the energy in China is produced in the western part of China. And you need to transport that energy to the east. You need to bring it inland. And you need ultra-high voltage grids, very sophisticated grids to move that energy safely and securely into other parts of China. And so there are a number of investment ideas just within the space of wind that we can play, not to mention solar, electric vehicles, batteries, et cetera. So this is a big and growing area within China, and China has clearly put itself on the map as a leader in the renewable space. In fact, 75% of all solar technology comes from China today. Another very important category that, as an investment idea, is healthcare and healthy living. So the healthcare system in China, as we've seen from all the pictures on the news of the overcrowded hospitals, especially with the pandemic, the healthcare system is inadequate given the number of people in China and also the demographics. China has an aging population, as we know. China has the highest number of people with diabetes in the world. China has a growing obesity rate. All of these things are contributing to strain on the healthcare system. And the problem is China only spends 1/20 of what the US spends on healthcare. So, having been in Bangkok, I have had the pleasure of actually seeking medical care and know that you have very strong medical facilities in Thailand. It's not so comfortable in China. And there's a photo kind of blurry here showing that during the pandemic, when people were elbowing each other out of the way trying to get into the hospital to be treated by a doctor. So in China, the average wait time to see a doctor is 3 hours for an 8-minute consultation. That needs to change. And it's not just, in healthcare, it's also healthier living. We see people wanting to go to the gym. People want to get laser eye surgery to correct their vision. They want cosmetic surgeries to look better. So there's many, many applications of healthcare and healthcare technology within China that we think are very exciting, not just the hospital system, but drug development, cancer technologies, diagnostic tools, AI, for example, the list goes on and on. So in conclusion, I want to leave you with 3 points. We think that this policy support can really help restore confidence into the market for this year. We've already seen a very strong rebound since some of these new policies were introduced late last year, and we think that this is not a 1 or 2 quarter type of change. We think this is durable and will last throughout the year. We know that China is targeting a new economic growth model that's very much driven by technology and innovation, and we see many areas that I mentioned, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's solar, whether it's healthcare, where China is developing cutting-edge capabilities in terms of its technology. And finally, we see this playing out across a number of sectors in the domestic China market, and we think that this is a really good time to really take another look into China and take advantage of what we think is going to be a very solid investment year. So thank you for your time. I will close with that.